Ronnie Coleman famously won his pro card at the IFBB World Championships, and he was about 80 pounds lighter than when he was competing as a pro. And the story goes that he was drug-free up until that point.
I mean, we
So,
see it now with Kendall. We saw it with
sure, sure.
Martin Daniels. We saw it
Yep.
with Cleveland Thomas. Like we're talking
Babacar.
world champions. Yeah, Babacar.
Hmm.
After they, Sean Clarita. That's the perfect one. He became Mr.
Kai
Olympia.
Green.
Kai Green. Most sports, if not, yeah, I don't want to say all sports, but most sports, there is one kind of licensing body,
Mm,
one world championships. There's a system and a
yep.
organization, if you will, to really see, okay, who's number one this year, right?
Yep.
Why is it that with natural bodybuilding specifically? Because if you look at the enhanced side, I mean, we know it's the IFBB, that's the top, right? But there's
Yep.
also, is there another org that I'm maybe missing aside from the IFBB?
So I think an important thing to remember is that there's actually two IFBBs now.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'll try to do a brief history lesson, and I know that your
Okay.
audiences appreciate history. Long ago back in the day, AAU, American Athletic Union, was in charge of amateur sport in the US. They lost a landmark battle with the NCAA as far as who got to really have reign over that, and essentially the AAU lost its sole governing body ability to govern amateur sport, and we saw the rise of the NCAA in kind of the modern sporting environment. Prior to that, weightlifting had its AAU governing committee, and a subcommittee was for bodybuilding. It was actually part of weightlifting, and that subcommittee was called the National Physique Committee, the NPC.
Mm.
So, yeah, and that is still the NPC today. The Manions, if you read Washington Post articles, potentially with some behind the back dealings, maybe not a legal vote, became the presidents of that, and we see the creation of the IFBB, the international body, which was originally created by the Weeders, which did actually apply to the IOC and get recognized as a World Games, not necessarily Olympic Games, but World Games IOC recognized sport. And we actually had IFBB bodybuilding as an international federation that was in the World Games until 2009, when it very unsurprisingly got kicked out for drug doping violations. So up until that point, the IFBB had regional affiliates all over the world, and the regional affiliate in the US just happened to be the NPC. Now, as you know, in most sports, there's professional and amateur. So the amateur IFBB World Championships moved around, went around, IOC sanctioned, technically drug tested, arguably not a natural competition based upon that 2009 ban. NPC athletes who won the Team Universe of the USA, they could go there as long as they're open to being potentially drug tested and compete in IFBB amateur world championships. Now you can get a pro card, and that is basically signing a contract and saying, I'm going to compete for prize money with the IFBB Pro League, which is a separate corporation owned by the Manions, who also eventually owned the NPC when they converted the NPC over to a private company, which may or may not be legal.
Mm.
Nonetheless, here we are, right? 2017 comes along. There are disputes and disagreements around being more serious about internationalization, drug testing, getting online with IOC WADA at IFBB International and NPC IFBB Pro League. So they split. So there are IFBB shows and there are NPC worldwide shows. And unless you actually know what you're looking at, sometimes it's unclear which federation you're competing under, because there's basically these two IFBBs. There's the IFBB Pro League, which is associated with the NPC, and they have NPC worldwide shows. And then there's still the original IFBB that is present worldwide and that has some degree of acceptance under IOC. And you can get an IFBB Pro Elite card, which you've probably seen if you compete in the original IFBB. And then there's still the pathway to the more well-known Pro League, IFBB Pro League, where you compete in the Olympia, the Arnold. And in the States, a lot of people just don't even know that that occurred or understand the distinction, because the IFBB pros that we all kind of focus on and think about in the Olympia and the Arnold and all that, still the same league. And the NPC, the US amateur affiliate, still the same US amateur affiliate. So there's not really much infiltration of the international arm of the IFBB into the US, but it's still very big and sometimes the only bodybuilding federation in certain countries, which have like a one sport rule for any given sport. So anyway, that's a thing. And NPC and the IFBB, because they were actually organized under WADA at one time, they have a better organizational structure, because you have to, if you want to try to go the route of getting into the World Games, of having committee-led organization and also having multiple levels, like a regional qualifier, national qualifier, and then international qualifier. So, for the longest time in the NPC, when it was still under the IFBB organization. Like in California, for example, I got to do the Contra Costa or I got to do the California State. And if I do well enough, place top two in an open division, then I can get a qualifier for the NPC Nationals or Junior Nationals or USAs. And then there I can potentially get a pro card or I can qualify and go compete at IFBB World Championships as an amateur. And a lot of the natural competitors from 10, 15 years ago, they were competing in the Team Universe, which was arguably the only natural show in the NPC at a national level where you could get, if you won the overall, you could accept the pro card. And then if you placed high enough, you could actually go to IFBB World Championships and potentially also get a pro card. And there are some notable pros over the years who did get their pro card going that route, who then decided to, as the story goes, become enhanced. Ronnie Coleman famously won his pro card at the IFBB World Championships, and he was about 80 pounds lighter than when he was competing as a pro. And the story goes that he was drug-free up until that point. So anyway, to answer your question and to go back to the original topic, I really do think committee-led, like a real sporting organization rather than a privately owned company organization to natural bodybuilding would be required for it to grow. Because when you keep expanding and expanding, it ends up becoming this really top-heavy organizational structure where you only have one or two people trying to run something that is huge. So one of the benefits that I really like at the WNBF is, like, for example, WNBF Italy does a great job having been out there. Big shout out to that team because they have a whole committee that runs that organization, and they have individual promoters, and you get much better communication, feedback to athletes, better experience, more consistency, which is a big complaint that a lot of people have in our space. So that type of thing I think is good.
Two things. The first thing is there was a post that I read on, I think it was Natty News Daily. They were kind of collaborated with another company or whatnot. And they were talking about, oh, how cool it would be to have the natural bodybuilding in the IFBB. Now, before you start or before you elaborate on this, because you will, we talked about this before. There's already a natural bodybuilding IFBB natural bodybuilding competition, if you will, with the Ben Weider in Montreal or something like that, right?
Yeah,
is that
the
accurate?
Weider Naturals.
That's it.
Yeah, it's been around for a while, actually.
Right. That's what I recall. That's been around for the last, what, 4 or 5 years, if I have that right?
I want to say it started right around or right before COVID. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe even earlier.
Mm,
And they talked a good bit about it. Natty News Daily has kind of talked about that whole pathway. Yeah.
Do you know what the story is? Is that something different than the Ben Weider's IFBB natural competition that they're running?
One and the same. So the NPC specifically, primarily led by the CPA's president. So that's the Canadian NPC / IFBB Pro League organization. They have natural shows, probably more than like per province or per capita than there are in the US. And they also have the Ben Weider Naturals. And there you can actually get a IFBB Pro card in a natural event. I want to be very clear here. There's a ton of natural athletes who do compete in the NPC / CPA or overall IFBB Pro League pathway natural events. But I will say that the drug testing standard there has been something that's been openly complained about. And there's been some pretty large amounts of pushback on that. Yeah, kind of like a 3-year drug-free rule or inconsistent testing. And the messaging around it, if you listen to some of the podcasts and statements, are like, well, we need to do this just because, like we want to make sure that it's legit. But yeah, sure, we'll test. Like, I don't think that group yet understands how important the high quality drug testing is to the natural community, or at least a large segment of the natural community. And the one thing I will say, though, is time will tell, because I think out of all the bodybuilding organizations out there, in terms of having good business sense and responding to the market, I think the NPC IFBB has shown that they're pretty good at that. And if the market is such that they won't support it and put dollars into the coffers of an organization unless they do better drug testing, then an intelligent business person would invest in that, right? That may change. Currently, it is, as it kind of always has been, in the natural community, is that there are degrees of naturalness. There's a lot of people I know who can't pass WNBF polygraphs. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily cheating on other polygraphs. It just may be that 10 years drug-free of specific compounds is something like, I don't necessarily think that's always a bad thing, because if I could wave my magic wand and snap my finger and say all organizations required everyone to be lifetime drug-free of all things, I think that would actually have a negative impact on our sport, because there's a lot of people who are young and do something like SARMs, or we take an example from 20 years ago, my own example in my early 20s, being able to get pro hormones over the counter over at bodybuilding.com and then going, oh, I don't want to go this route. Am I now forced forever to compete in the NPC?
Right.
That's probably not what we want. We don't want to be taking people in their 20s who don't even maybe necessarily have their brain fully formed from like a neurodevelopment standpoint to like have decisions which maybe have an impact on their physique, but relatively minor in the grand scheme, unable to forever, ever compete in tested organizations. We're essentially kind of pushing people towards drugs, which seems out of alignment with what I think our shared collective values are as a natural bodybuilding community. So I like that there are opportunities for people if they are 3, 5, 7, 10 years drug free, that there are certain caveats and exceptions because there needs to be nuance to it for whether you used ephedra or whether you were injecting, growth hormone. Those to me are not the same, right? So anyway, I guess the point is that not only is the NPC making a push, they've stated they want to have a natural show in every 50 states and they want to expand it. They're actually announced that they want to have IFBB pro competitions that are drug tested. So they are really coming for natural bodybuilding. And I think if the natural bodybuilding community remains relatively poorly organized, semi-splintered, not very cooperative, and kind of operating in a crabs in a barrel scenario, it's a couple years from now before the biggest quote unquote national organization is going to be the NPC IFBB
and takes
because
over.
yeah, just because they're going to do all the things that natural bodybuilding seems unable to do on its own, unfortunately. That said, I personally, that's why I give a lot of support to the WNBF because I think it has actually a bigger international presence than the IFBB NPC, believe it or not, especially after the split. And I think obviously the drug testing is the highest standard. And I think it has a rich history. And most importantly, the people involved in WNBF are very committed to natural bodybuilding from a principle-based perspective. So, yeah.
Interesting. When I hear about like the IFBB and the NPC, if they are going to attack full force at natural bodybuilding, how that could potentially, they could take over in that regard. Then what I think is, okay, is it about money or is it about the prestige of like a name, like a brand, if you will, because of the history of that brand, right? Because we think IFBB, we think Arnold, Larry Scott, the competitors that mainly inspired enhanced or non-enhanced athletes to get into bodybuilding, right? Mike Mentzer, right? I mean, look at him. The resurgence of him on YouTube is huge, right? For natural or enhanced. So it's quite interesting. I can see how that could potentially lead natural bodybuilders to want to compete in the IFBB. I mean, we see it now with Kendall. We saw it with Martin Daniels. We saw it with Cleveland Thomas. Like we're talking
Babacar.
World champions. Yeah, Babacar. After Sean Clarita, that's a perfect one. He became Mr. Olympia. Kai Green, right? Well, he competed at the Mr. Olympia. Arguably should have won a title, but that's a whole other discussion. But there you go. So, if we're talking about world champions within the WNBF, I mean, they're going to the IFBB because it's almost like, okay, where could there be a better future? And
Babacar is coming back. I think, I think natural bodybuilding is growing. We've seen some pretty incredible things. Worlds is getting better every year. The Orton Cup seems to be getting better every year. Like it is definitely growing, but I think some key things really need to be focused on. And in my opinion, the fact that Longevity Muscle Podcast is the best place to find out about prior natural champions. I love it that you're doing this. Thank you. You're doing a huge service to us. And I do want the podcast to be successful, but that shouldn't be the only place to find out about these guys and gals, right? And I think we can only be frustrated or be like, oh, why is it that they love all these prior IFBB Olympia champions? And instead of looking outward, I think that really needs to be an inward look. Like, what aren't we doing to successfully promote and give credibility to the champions? Kenny, let me ask you this. You have a podcast dedicated to having all these prior champions on. How many of the organizations in natural bodybuilding have directly reached out to you and said, hey, I would love to do a partnership to where our pros get interviewed by you, or you come and you do a live commentary on our live stream, and that we set up kind of like a promotional circuit where you come and are part of our media package? We could definitely work together on this. How many?
None, to be fair. None has reached out in that fashion. They've wanted to maybe come on the podcast to maybe promote their company, but not into the extent that, not what you said. So there you go. There it is right there. So yeah, that's interesting. I made a post on Instagram. I know for those of you listening, maybe you saw it, maybe you didn't because it was on an Instagram story, but about after my chat with David K, it sparked this thought of like, why is there not at least a super show, like an event, even if it's not every year, where the head of each of the top orgs, DFAC Worlds, WNBF Worlds, PNBA Natural Olympia, I guess that's their biggest show over their world championships, which it's like, okay, which one's bigger? You'd think the world championship should be bigger, but this is the whole problem with natural bodybuilding. Anyhow, we were talking and we thought, okay, why is there not at least one event where the head of these orgs can come together and then their champions, or at least the top three, could compete at an event at the end of the year? And so I tagged all the promoters, and none of them reached out or got back to me. And
Kenny.
I even, yeah, so
Oh, I love you. I love your optimism. These heads, I'm going to say this as politically nice as possible, and people are going to
yeah.
understand what I'm saying. The heads of these organizations are not sending each other Christmas cards every year.
Mm.
Let's just put it that way. And the closest, and there should be, we should understand why the closest thing we have to super shows are actually independent show slash organizations that allow pros from other organizations to come compete with them. Like the Mr.
Mm.
America is probably the biggest example in the US. The ANBF show over in Austria. And also, you'll notice that they have probably the best production quality out of all the organizations that we see compared to them. They get to focus on this one show. They let everybody else in. They have prize money and they promote themselves as these super shows. And the fact that it has to happen outside of the organizations, I think that should tell you something. I don't think we're going to see cooperation between a lot of these organizations because the reality is that they're organizations, quote unquote, but they're ran by people, individual businesses in almost all cases. Not always. There are definitely some committee ran things, but that means when you have history and beef and you've been competitors for a long time and you have personal issues with one another, that really prevents any type of rational collaboration or being able to view things as for the betterment of the sport. If you did have a committee and a kind of a firewall between your own personal identity and the politics that goes on behind the scenes, which are very understandable, and some of these beefs have legitimate reasons, I don't think anyone can just be like, if you guys just talk this out, like that's been tried to be, like that's literally happened over the last 20 years. There have been summits where they got together and they just fought
Oh, wow.
over the years and weren't able to come away with anything productive and just made the divisions worse. There are lawsuits going on behind the scenes or have
Oh,
happened, Kenny.
it's
It's
wild.
the beef is deep, my friend.
The beef is deep.
Um, it's unfortunate. Like if you've been around the scene long enough, you talk to people, you find out all this stuff, and you're just like, wow, okay, so they're not going to be sending each other Christmas cards anytime soon. And you understand why we have these separate large organizations and that the only super shows we have are from unaffiliated organizations. So what's the smart move? Yeah, you actually partner with these big super shows. You brand it and you say, let's see who has the best champion. And then the rising tide lifts all ships. But when the personal beefs and the drama is so strong that it supersedes the ability to make those kind of decisions, then here we are. So
Mm.
people have been talking about this since the 90s and it hasn't happened. Literally 25 years of us going, why can't the organizations come together? It is simply not going to happen. I think the best likelihood of what we're going to see is that an organization is able to pull ahead of the rest. It does enough things right, and it becomes seen as quote unquote the most legitimate out of it. It gets its stuff together. And so for me, that is why I do a lot of time and energy spent promoting the WNBF, because for all its flaws, because it's all just humans. None of us are perfect, but I think the principles are in the right place, the values are in the right place. It has the international infrastructure, which I think is really important. So it's not just like the World Series of baseball, which is, hey, we had Toronto in there.
Right.
If you want a legitimate world championships, it should be mostly international people with the U.S. being represented. If we really want to know who's the best in the sport, we want to be pulling from the billions of people in Asia. We want to be pulling from Europe. We want to be pulling South America, Africa, Middle East, Australasia as a broader region. And I do see that happening in the WNBF, and it's quite cool. And they're maintaining a commitment to high quality testing. So honestly, I'll tell you this. I've said to my good friends who are involved with the WNBF is I'm here to support natural bodybuilding. And if all of a sudden a different organization was able to do all of that and do it better, I would start supporting them. I have
Right.
loyalty to the sport, not in any organization. Ultimately, I care about the thing that has been really important for all of us. And organizations serve the sport, not the other way around, in my opinion. So, in my mind, what organization is best serving the sport? Great, I'm behind it.
That's very well said. I can understand everything you mentioned as far as the business side of things, because obviously, as I've gotten older now, that's understandable. Unfortunate, but understandable. And
Yeah.
I think this is where having an investor come in, like you mentioned, if that was a thing, where money can save the sport in a way, because if there's a lot of money thrown at it in the right direction, then collectively these groups either get washed away or brought together in some fashion where, okay, now all the athletes are forced to compete at, well, one organization, and it's not a private organization, but a worldwide thing, right?
Well, I think what is realistic right now, I've been a little doom and gloomy and talking about the negative sides of it, is that you stay open. If I was magically head of an organization, I would not be looking in the other lanes next to me. I think there's
Mm.
far too much of that going on in natural bodybuilding, is worrying about what other organizations are doing. I think instead you look at what they're doing, what's successful, and you take the best parts and you leave the rest. Open up your organization to allow as much cross competition as there is without watering down the quality, making sure that any pros who want to come compete with you, they've got a pro card with a similar number of competitors, not competing against, crossovers from an amateur, for example, being able to produce their drug testing results, being able to pass your higher quality drug test if that's the case, and then having these big shows, drawing other people in, and focusing on production quality, raising the prize money. One of the things, I had this experience now that I turned pro. I was on a plane and someone was like, oh, like they saw I had a WBF shirt on and they asked me, what is that? And I told them, and then like, oh, are you a pro? And I was like, yeah, actually I'm a pro bodybuilder. That's so cool. And all of a sudden their eyes lit up. And then they asked me, like, what do pros compete for? And I was like, oh, we compete for prize money. Oh, how much can you make? And all of a sudden I got embarrassed because
Mm.
I'm never going to win prize money, Kenny. Let's be honest. Like I'm maybe like I'm
Maybe.
not trying to
That's what I was
count
gonna say.
myself out.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
Depends,
I'm
right?
pushing hard. We're gonna see what
Yeah.
happens, right? I'm gonna do my best to try to do some damage in the pro ranks.
Awesome.
But the only reason I say that is I didn't turn pro for the chance to compete for prize money, but the fact that our world championship is such a low value in terms of all the different federations. This is a across the board issue. It's almost embarrassing to tell someone, yeah, if I place third in a big show, I might get $500. And
Yeah.
I know there's no money in the sport, and it's not like we can just produce it, but making better business decisions and investing means taking an initial loss and betting on something, making intelligent bets. And I think there's very little willingness to do that because of how natural bodybuilding has been. And right now, the growth of the sport, I think, is growing beyond maybe the optimism or the hopes or the understanding of what it could be in the minds of some of the people running it. And if their investment matched the growth curve, we could see some things changing really rapidly. But it's hard to tell someone on a plane that if I travel internationally, I lose money, even if I win the overall title, right? My hotel
Yeah.
room, paying for my own drug testing, and registering from the sport is less than winning the overall. And if I won every single show in the season, I'd maybe break even because of all the flight costs. Like it doesn't signal a professional sport, even though I'm a professional athlete. And it's not about the money, but it's about the seriousness and how whether people take like bodybuilding. We're already struggling. We're flexing in speedos on stage, right? Can't we need to like really think about professionalism, organization, consistency, and in integrity, and doing these things in a way that is serious, taking it seriously. So yeah, it is just hard to say that to someone on a plane. Like, yeah, don't worry about the prize money. Like, no, I do it for the love. And then they're like, yeah, but how much is it? Like, I don't want to tell you. It's embarrassing, honestly.
Yeah. How many sports do you think there are? I think there's quite a bit of Olympic sports even that are kind of on that same field as the bodybuilding, or at least the natural bodybuilding. Do you know anything about that though?
Man, it's a funny thing, Kenny. Like in many ways, bodybuilding is arguably one of the most popular sports in the world. Anybody who
Right.
goes to the gym and recreationally trains to improve the way they look is a recreational bodybuilder. Visually, it's actually quite appealing if a show is done well, it has good production, and especially if it's a high level. The shock and awe of a shredded physique, even in a drug-free one, is pretty cool. And natural bodybuilding, I think it's probably more inspirational and aspirational rather than kind of like almost like the circus freak show of watching, say, the IFBB Open division. So it has a lot of potential. And the fact that powerlifting right now is eating, they're doing great. They've got the Sheffield where you can win 40, 50 grand if you're the top champion. And there's multiple pro circuits now where the best powerlifters,
Wow.
drug-free powerlifters, are getting all the shine. And enhanced powerlifting is small and fractured. So if people are willing to watch people just do the squat, bench, and deadlift for one rep, what is should not be very visually appealing because it's aspirational and interesting, I know we can get our shit together as natural bodybuilding because we're built to be visual. And there are other sports, like, for example, sumo wrestling, huge in Japan, not big in the rest of the world, no money in it. But there is, like, you can go compete in sumo nationals in the US, and there's a bunch of sports like that are small coming up. But because they have the prestige of being in the World Games or the Olympic Games, there's a little more prestige. And we don't have that, so we have to find that professionalism elsewhere.